Hello, and welcome to the North Coast Journal Preview, where we take a look at the stories being followed in the current edition of the North Coast Journal. I'm your host, Dave Frank, and I'm joined today by Thad Greenson, news editor, and Jennifer Fumiko Cahill, arts and features editor at the North Coast Journal. Welcome, guys.
Hey, Dave.
Hey, David. How you doing?
Pretty good. On this fine day, feels like balmy out there, even though it's windy and leaves are everywhere. It's certainly fall, but it's a little warm. Hopefully you guys are getting out there and enjoying your weekend time. Well, you can always hope, right? One can hope.
True.
Yeah.
Hope springs eternal.
Yeah, I mean it was trick or treat time. It was Halloween, so there was kiddies all around and about.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. I saw some really great trick or treaters out there, and it was really lovely. And also, full-size candy bar people were out in force. And I would like shout out to the person who was also handing out bit of honeys. Disrespected candy, very good.
Yeah, that's a throwback for sure. Thad, why don't you tell us what is on the cover of this week's North Coast Journal?
Yeah, this week we have a really outstanding story from a freelancer, J.A. Savage, who has written a fair amount of stuff for us over the last handful of years. But this is an issue that is kind of near and dear to her heart. So she's writing about the decommissioning of the Humboldt Bay nuclear power plant. So I don't know, it might have escaped kind of viewers and listeners, but a couple weeks ago, the PG&E just sent out a very brief press release saying that kind of the decommissioning of their nuclear power site was complete, and they were submitting kind of the final paperwork to the Nuclear Energy Regulatory Commission to have it, officially decommissioned. And so J.A. Savage pitched writing the story for us, which I was very thankful for, and she has been following kind of the ins and outs of the Humboldt Bay nuclear plant for 20 plus years. Wow. First kind of as an activist, and then as a journalist covering it. And kind of starts the story with this terrifying anecdote about going in to observe kind of the early stages of some of the decommissioning efforts, and being on a tour of the actual reactor, the spent fuel casings, and being locked in kind of the reactor space with a PR flak from PG&E, and talking about how kind of her claustrophobia set in, and she desperately wanted to get out, but really she was more afraid of radiation than actual claustrophobia. So the story just really kind of details, her accounts of kind of the lifespan of this nuclear power plant, which is pretty incredible. It was built in 1963, but then taken offline in, I think it was 1976, because they discovered, I don't know how you discover such a thing after the fact, but that it was built directly on top of a fault line, which rendered it completely unsafe. And so that was 1976. So now we're looking at, 25 years of decommissioning. And because it was it was taken offline before its, lifespan was up, it was in one of the first sites like this in the United States that really had to be decommissioned and wound down. And kind of the full costs of such an effort really come into play, or come into focus. So, for example, this, was a power plant that was operational for 13 years. I think the construction costs of it were about $65 million. They had now spent $1.1 billion, billion with a B, taking this thing down and apart and trying to, quote unquote, render it safe. And I think the article also does a really good job of kind of capturing what that means, which is now we have, a site with nuclear toxic waste on it that is housed in a very expensive and very high tech structure, which is kind of like a submarine that's buried underground. And it is supposed to be secure enough that it can withstand missile strikes and stuff like that in the event of a terrorist attack, and also that it keeps all of that kind of toxic waste inside of it. But this, this thing has a lifespan of about 100 years. As Jay Savage notes in the story, some of the toxic elements, namely plutonium, has some people believe a lifespan of 240,000 years. And so there's a big question of what happens with this waste once the lifespan of its current receptacle kind of is reached. And then also, with all the concerns and the new reality of sea level rise, this is a site that's right on the edge of Humboldt Bay and King Salmon. And so environmentalists have all kinds of concerns about the potential of sea level rise to kind of expedite that process and bring it to a head sooner than a century away. I think the piece is really engagingly written. I think Jay Savage writes it with a lot of perspective and a lot of personality, and I think it's also utterly terrifying. So I would really urge everybody to give it a careful read.
Yeah, I thank you for the overview and summary. It's definitely the prose style is engaging, takes you through this tortured tale. So I remember hearing a quote that the difference between a comedy and a tragedy is what happens to the hero in the end. And so this one is probably a tragedy, only because of the 250,000-year element to it. But one thing I think it's worth pointing out, and you alluded to it, she was part of the Redwood Alliance. She was an activist, so she's got a front row seat and hands-on participation in different aspects of the process, the decommissioning process, and other perspectives that are really, really engaging. So I definitely would love for people to check it out.
Yeah, real quickly on that note, I think it's also she has an interesting perspective on how those early activists back in the 1970s really kind of shaped the future of this process and were really instrumental in getting PG&E to create a ratepayer-funded basically trust fund that ultimately paid for some of these decommissioning costs and stuff like that, and just kind of the foresight they had. And now we're in a situation where history is repeating itself to some extent, where the utility company kind of feels like it has a solution currently, and now a new wave of environmental activists are saying we need to start planning for what's next with the site, because 100 years isn't nearly long enough to plan out, especially given sea level rise and some of the compounding factors we talked about.
So not only is it an engaging read, but there's a to be continued element of it, because it's going to be front page for future activists' efforts. So Definitely. Thank you again for covering it.
Yeah, it's an important story.
What else are you covering on the news beat this week?
Yeah, so last week, I think right before we came on air with you, we kind of got this bombshell news drop that Eureka Police Chief Steve Watson, who's been in the position for about 4 years now, I think about 4.5 years, kind of suddenly announced he was retiring. And I don't think too many people outside of his inner circle saw this coming. We certainly didn't. And it obviously this announcement comes as EPD is in multiple levels of kind of turmoil and crisis. And so it raised a lot of questions. I think there's been a lot of speculation about what the chief's, what the real reasons were behind him deciding to step down. And so we kind of dive into that for a news story this week.
So not to spoil the engagement on people checking out firsthand and making sure they read it, check it out themselves. But it sounds like it was an organic kind of thing in his life, and his perspective is that he's had a really stellar tenure. And that there's never a good time. I think there's a joke, or he jokes that he could wait for rainbows and unicorns, but that's just not the case. And any perspective on kind of his tenure and kind of how he came across when he spoke with you about it?
Yeah, so first of all, I mean, as somebody who has covered EPD for going on 20 years now, I would say that unicorns and rainbows are nothing I've ever seen in EPD, and nothing that's on the horizon for the organization. It's been certainly defined by a lot of turmoil and kind of multi-layered crises for a while now. So, the biggest question I think everybody had is the kind of community focus for a long time with EPD, I think now for months, has been on this text messaging investigation that the city launched in the wake of a Sacramento Bee story featuring a bunch of leaked text messages between a unit of 6 officers. And the messages, I think as viewers and listeners will remember, were just really abhorrent, had abhorrent language that officers were using that was just misogynistic and violent and dehumanizing in all kinds of ways, especially toward women and the homeless community. And this investigation has been going on for 7 months now, and had just kind of culminated. So the outside law firm that was hired to do it had just delivered its report, its full investigative report, which is 200 pages long and filled with addendums and stuff like that, to City Hall. And it's going through this legal review now. Another outside law firm is kind of determining both whether the investigation's findings are supported by its evidence and whether the disciplinary actions that the city wants to take are defensible, and will hold up and withstand challenges. And so I think a lot of people drew an immediate connection of this report just arriving at City Hall, and then, a couple weeks later, him announcing his resignation. So that was something I wanted to talk to Chief Watson about. And he was, he was very full-throated in saying that, the reasons for his resignation are multi-layered, and there's a lot of factors, but that the idea that there's some smoking gun or hidden bombshell or something that's gonna implicate him in this investigative report is just not there. And he went so far as to say that he, explicitly asked the investigators to look at him and EPD's command staff and their role in allowing, enabling, or anything like that. These types of messages to be exchanged with officers, or the kind of culture that would allow this. And he says that they found absolutely nothing, and say as much in the report. And so he said he's very hopeful that when all is said and done, at least that portion of the report will be allowed to be made public. But what he did say is that police chief of any organization is a really hard job, and he's kind of been dealing for 4.5 years now with kind of crisis after crisis, from a police shooting of a mentally unstable military veteran to the BLM protests in the wake of George Floyd's murder that kind of gripped the nation, and Eureka, to a staffing crisis and the public safety power shutoffs from a handful of years ago. And he just kind of says it's a 24/7, 365-day job, and that he's always on call and always checking his 2 cell phones. And he has 5 kids, 3 of whom are still at home. And he just kind of is at this point where he decided, he'd been thinking about moving on, but he kind of thought it would be a year or 2 down the road. And he said that this coalition of factors led him to believe that just now is the right time. Yeah.
So just to pick up on that about it being the right time, can you tell us a little bit? I thought it was really interesting to share a little bit about his background, and then also what he's potentially looking towards in the next phase.
Yeah, so I think regardless of kind of what folks think about Chief Watson in his role as police chief, he's an utterly fascinating guy. So prior to going into law enforcement, he first went to ministerial school and studied theology, thinking he wanted to enter the ministry, and then decided that wasn't a fit, and then got a teaching credential and was a substitute teacher for a bit, and kind of jokingly says that after subbing in a 5th grade classroom, decided he wanted to do something safer and entered law enforcement. But he also did a several-year stint in the U.S. Army, and then kind of found what he felt like was his calling in law enforcement, and has now been a police officer for, I think, 27 years. Started with the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Department, and then has been with Eureka Police Department for I think 16 or 17 years now. And steadily worked his way up through the ranks, and he's currently, just again the kind of the layer of interest of the guy is while serving as Eureka's police chief, he's also been working toward a master's degree in public safety administration. So it was definitely a guy with varied interests, and doesn't seem well. He said plainly that he doesn't really know what's next. He knows, he's not done working. He wants to spend more time with family, but then he's, not closing the door on potentially teaching in the law enforcement academy locally, or consulting, or doing some other function of kind of, the way he sees it, moving law enforcement forward to meet the new challenges of kind of 21st century policing in America. But not with a badge and a gun, and not being, kind of on the front lines or on call all the time.
Yeah, I thought that was really important to highlight that he's got some, legit experience now at this point, and that he's hoping to parlay that into something beneficial to give back and teach. And I thought that was a really, an important highlight of your article, of your coverage. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Right on. Well, we'll look to hear more, hopefully, about policing reform that he could maybe contribute to, or at least the dialogue as a civilian down the road. So we'll talk to you about that down the road, hopefully.
Definitely.
Right on. How about you, Jennifer? What is going on the Arts and Features beat this week?
Well, this week we have a story by Jessica Ashley Silva, who you may recall, she of the failed attempt to infuse mozzarella with cannabis.
Oh, that's her.
I confess I had forgotten.
Right? R.I.P. those two hideous gray lumps of cheese. And not all of her experiments are failures, let me tell you. She is also one of the admins of the Humboldt Foodies, so she is connected with a bunch of people. She's, part of a very big food community in Humboldt County. And this week she's writing about community and about making hard cider. So
excellent.
Yes, and we have tons and tons of apples in Humboldt County, and we have apple trees that go back way, way back. And we have sometimes an excess. I mean, how many people do you know that have apple trees and whatnot that are just like, do you want some apples?
Totally.
And you're like, please take some apples. So for people who are up to their elbows in apples right now, we have news for you. You can turn that into hard cider. It's not as hard as it sounds. Get it? See what I did there? So Jessica has a recipe in here that's not really a recipe. It's sort of a step-by-step, this is what it's like, this is what you do. But there aren't really measurements, partly because how many apples do you have? How much are you trying to get? How much do you get when you press them out? And then once you press them out, what kind of cider do you want to make? How sweet do you want to make it? How strong do you want to make it? These are all things you can play with. And also the kind of apple you use. Is it a tart apple? Is it a sweet apple? But she's giving you guidelines that kind of talk about, how to ward off mold. Nobody wants mold.
Moldy cider, no.
Yeah, where to get your equipment, how to, who to ask. That's really important. For example, at the local, brew shop, like at, there's Kenny Berry, who is at, Humboldt Brews, who does homebrew, who does all kinds of equipment. You can buy your carboy containers, those big glass jugs and things, and, ask for advice, because it turns out that people who brew love to get other people to brew. They want you in their cult. And they will give you advice, they will share experiences and talk you through stuff. And she met a bunch of people. Among them, she met Sarah Borak, who actually we've written before about her. We had a story called Apples and Apples. She has an apple press, and she brings it to the Kneeling Glen Farm Stand. She brings it to the Medieval Festival of Courage when that's on. And she's just out there in a colorful apron, and she will press the apples you show up with. So already we're, reaching out to people. Jessica ended up getting to know Aaron Weshnak, who we've written about in relationship to Doka beer. There's one of the folks who kind of split off from the booth, where Aaron used to be a head brewer, or the head brewer, hired him to come up with recipes for interesting new beers that have things like lemongrass in them. And so he's the beer guy, and he's in his kitchen experimenting and tasting things and doing all kinds of stuff. And so he really helped Jessica too to find her feet and figure out what she's doing and sympathize with her when she loses 4 gallons to mold and things like that. Another exciting thing that she got to do was collect apples from people. And, she talks about how you're not only connecting with a community in terms of who's helping you, and there are many people helping, who's helping you press, when your friends come over and help you bottle, but, who's going to give you apples in exchange for a few bottles of cider of the finished product, but also connecting to the people who planted those trees. One fellow, Aaron, I believe, who had a tree that's been on his 5-generation family land, planted, almost 100 years ago with, I'm sure the hope of providing food for families to come that, lived on this land. And, it's connecting to the people from the past, it's connecting to your community in the present. And then you make this thing that you enjoy typically together, with each other. And so it's been this really fabulous social experience for Jessica. And she describes it, as well as giving some important tips. Her number one tip, she said, the mantra that you want to repeat, and this is probably good life advice anyway during COVID, is sanitize everything. Sanitize everything, which you can't see it because I have long sleeves, but I actually have it tattooed on my forearm now because of the pandemic. But yeah, sanitize everything. She talks about how much, more sugar, it turns out, makes things boozier. She talks about experimenting, and she also warns you that once you start, you're going to go a little crazy. You're going to want to do everything because, at least in her experience, once you figure out, well, if I tinker with this element, if I make it, if I brew it longer or shorter, then it's more this or that, then you're like, well, next time I got to do this. It's not like getting a recipe and, instantly knowing like, okay, this recipe works or it doesn't. It's tinkering. And then there are so many varieties of apples in Humboldt County. The Gravenstein gets a lot of press. And it's deserved. It's a fine pie apple. She's a fan of the pink pearl, which actually has pink flesh. It's very fancy. And, there's just a zillion kinds. And also apples, they crossbreed and crazy things happen. She talks about wildcrafting and kind of grabbing whatever apples. Apples that come to you from friends, throwing together mixed varieties and the kind of mutt apples that show up. So it just seems like a real adventure. And it's an adventure that at the end of it, if all goes well, you get a boozy delight.
It's one of those things that even if it goes slightly wrong, it's still worthy.
Yeah, it's not like making gin in your bathtub and maybe going blind. It's a gentler process than that. And she talks about, looking out for overflow, like things can still go wrong. You can end up with a mess or stuff you have to throw away, but it's apple juice. And we got apples literally growing on trees. So it's a fun experiment. And I hope everybody tries it and writes in to tell Jessica how it went.
So one of the things that Jessica mentioned, well, two things Jessica mentioned. One is that whole Wildcrafters community locally is very active, and they have their own Facebook page and everything, so people can go engage like passively, I guess, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, and that's a great way to get connected. As much as I think that, okay, Zuckerberg, I don't care if you're listening, you're the devil, you're a terrible person, but the things that people do with making Facebook groups are kind of cool. And Humboldt is still very much like Facebook oriented somehow, even though other platforms have come along. And that's how, we've had other people like Kitty Lay wrote for us about her coming into fishing. That's how she ended up meeting people who taught her to fish. And likewise, you can find people who will help teach you to bake. Conversation about how she came into apples, of all things. She had a ton of apples in her house when I stopped by, and she said, yeah, I met this woman who had an apple orchard, and she was elderly and not able to, pick all of them by herself. So she said, come by and pick. And it's connecting people and food on, for example, Humboldt Foodies. And the Wildcrafting group, you can definitely find somebody to mentor you through making, the smallest imaginable batch of cider to the largest. And there's just lots of room for experimenting and meeting people who also like to make fizzy hard cider.
Right on. No, this is really cool. I especially like that it's by showing you step by step. It's one of those things where you're like, okay, well, maybe it's not, so complicated that I can't do it myself.
Right? Sanitize
Cool, right?
everything.
Yes. Yes. On that note, we have to wrap up this week. Thank you, Jen, for sharing this article. It's really cool. We appreciate you. North Coast Journal is available on newsstands now and also online anytime. Pick one up, stay informed, and stay sanitized. Until next week. Thank you both. Take care.
Thanks, Dave.
See you next week.